Hey everyone, and welcome. We are very excited to have you all here. As you know, we are not able to host our wine classic this year, which we are really sad about. We love that event, but we were excited to be able to still get together as a group and talk about wine, hear more from Erika. But first, we want to just give a shout out to our Bronze Door Society. Our Bronze Door Society is who helps organize our wine classic each year, and the funds that we raised for it help our conservation efforts here at the Mariners Museum. So you can see this lovely painting behind me is one that we have raised money for in the past, the conservation of it. And that was all because of people like you who have come out to our wine classics and help support the group. So they are just a great group at the museum. They do so much for our conservation efforts, and we are thankful to have them. We're going to pass it off to Howard, and he is going to say a quick hello.
Yeah, thanks, Molly, and welcome everybody. Cheers. I wish I was clinking glasses with somebody, but hopefully everybody else is holding up their glass as well. I'll take my drink in a moment. You go ahead and feel free to do yours. I just wanted to echo what Molly said about the Bronze Door Society. So grateful for your partnership, for your friendship. I just wanted to say, I think everybody who's listening could probably repeat this with me now, but we say at the museum that the Mariners Museum and Park connects people to the world waters, because through the waters, through our shared maritime heritage, we're connected to one another, right? That's the mission. And we're finally back to doing it in person. We opened our galleries, of course, to members and supporters for a week, but we opened to the general public right before Memorial Day weekend. And you know, over Memorial Day weekend, we saw a 25% increase in our number of visitors over 2019. And because in the role that I'm in, of course, I have to pay attention to the business. And do you know, we doubled, more than doubled actually, our gift shop sales that weekend. And so I would say we're back with a vengeance. And as you can imagine, just the reviews that we've received have been so positive, and our team, the energy on our team is just great as we're feeding off of just loving on the community that we serve. But tonight is a great reminder that we've also, over the past year, developed this terrific capacity to be able to serve people now nationally and globally. And we even have some folks that are outside of the local area of the museum on tonight's program. And we're going to continue doing that, because this has really expanded our ability to reach people with a mission. And so in the spirit of that, nobody signed on to listen to me talk tonight. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Erika and settle in to enjoy this program alongside of you all. So welcome and thank you.
All right, thank you, Molly. Thank you, Howard, and welcome everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started here. I will begin sharing my screen so that you can see the presentation that I put together. So as Howard mentioned, as part of our mission, that we connect people through the world's waters, and we're still able to do that even if we're not in person tonight, but I'm really happy to be a part of this evening and get to continue this kind of annual event with the Wine Classic. So tonight, even though the Mariners Museum connects each other through the world's waters, because that's how we are connected, this evening, we're going to connect a little differently through the topic of wine, which I think is, you know, just a great indication. This is a beverage that is enjoyed globally. And while I wish we could be clinking glasses in person, I think this will be a great second best thing. So with that, I'm going to say cheers and begin by kind of talking about this. Now, the topic of wine is one that can be covered in so many facets. I love this chart that you're looking at because it shows the breadth of color, the variety of glasses that you drink wine out of, the different flavors from sparkling to sweet to dry to robust, full-bodied, kind of all these words that you associate with wine, whether you're a novice or an intermediary with the subject, or if you're, you know, a sommelier or a wine expert. But I really feel like wine is one of those beverages that is enjoyed thoroughly globally. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And so we are going to be, exploring that a little more today. So first, I want to kind of explain what the definition of wine is. And per the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it is defined as the alcoholic fermented drink of fresh grapes used as a beverage. And it goes on to further explain the alcoholic, usually fermented juice of a plant product, such as fruit, used as a beverage. And the reason I kind of wanted to explain both of those definitions, again, that's from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is because while we think of wine typically in one way, on a global scale, other countries, other continents, other winemakers, might think of it differently. So some of the terms associated with wine and cultivation are Vitis vinifera, and this is the common grape native to Europe and Central Asia, predominantly in the Mediterranean region. So this is kind of going to be the grape that began it all. And we're going to look over the next several minutes and several slides at kind of how this grape transformed our world in terms of providing this beverage that, as I've mentioned, is enjoyed globally, is a major import-export, and has been kind of influential in a lot of ways throughout history. The second term is viniculture, the cultivation of grapes for the production of wine. Vinification, the conversion of grape juice or the like into an alcoholic liquid by fermentation. So that's going to be the actual process of converting, this grape and taking it into the beverage that we know as wine. And then a vintner is one who deals in or sells wine, who is a wine merchant, or my personal favorite term of this definition is an innkeeper selling wine. Now that is all from the Oxford English Dictionary, defining all of these aspects of those people and steps involved with the conversion process. I love, though, that innkeeper selling wine, it's such an old school kind of sound and feel. I don't know if we really have innkeepers the way we used to way back when, but I still think it's great that the Oxford English Dictionary includes it as part of their definition. So before we delve a little bit into the history, and I do say a little bit because this product has been around for thousands of years. It's been transformed, it's been transformative. And there's really just in today's program not enough time to cover every aspect of it in the detail that perhaps maybe it deserves, or that I would want to, or that somebody would really want to hear. So we're going to kind of give just a general overview of how wine kind of started, where it came from, how it was produced, and the evidence that kind of explains all of this to us. And what you're looking at now is a modern map showing about 10 to 15 of the top wine producing regions in the world. Some of these might be pretty familiar. Things like France and Italy are often associated with wine. Places like Russia, though, I honestly, prior to doing some of the research on this project, would not have associated Russia with being a top producing country of wine, just because I think of Russia as being so cold, but they make it happen. So I just want to give another quick second here for everybody to really soak in this map and some of the places that are listed and named. Again, most of them, if you're even a novice in the wine industry, wine production, knowledge, and have some sort of basis, some of these places are going to sound pretty familiar. And those are going to be some of the areas that we're going to slightly focus on a little more today in the program. So using this map from our collection, because it has some great latitude and longitude lines, I've indicated where the best regions for wine production come from, as agreed by most historians, scholars, and those who are in the vinification industry, So if you can see here on the map, those best areas are between 30 degrees to 50 degrees latitude north and 30 degrees to 50 degrees latitude south. So if you kind of look in those bands in those two regions that I blocked off with the yellow outlines, really kind of take a look at some of those areas that fall between those two regions. And again, just thinking back on that map that I just moved away from, and then as we think ahead to some of the areas that we're going to kind of focus on, it's going to kind of make sense how some of these locales became top-notch wine producing areas. And beginning with that are going to be what we refer to as old world wines. Specifically, it begins back in the ancient world, moves into the old world. And by old world, we refer to in Africa. So those three continually inhabited by people. So this is where the story of wine is going to begin, but maybe not in particular where you might think. Evidence has recently come to light by archaeologists that this place, Jiahu, China, has the oldest known remnants of wine and wine beginning around 7000 BC or BCE before the Nakht. Prior to that, it was believed that BC or BCE. And then again, thinking about wine as we know it today, China may not come to the forefront of your mind if you were to be asked, where does wine come from? Where do you best enjoy wine from? It's actually still becoming an up and coming place, the region of China in general. But if you look at this image on the left-hand side here, it was recovered from the site, the archaeological site at Jiahu. And this brick kind of shows some details of early winemaking in China. So again, as far back as 7000 BC, we know that at least one person or group or groups of people were starting this process, this cultivation of grapes, and then the conversion into wine as we know today. Now, it probably tasted a little different because the wine that was coming out of Jiahu wasn't necessarily from the Vitis vinifera that I mentioned earlier, but most likely from this Chinese Hawthorn berry. So the evidence that these archaeologists were finding came from these Paleolithic jars shown on the left-hand side. They did some excavation, some chemical work that I won't even begin to pretend to understand, but they do. And their evidence proves that there was a wine or a wine-like substance in these jars. So I would like to introduce some of the evidence that they have found here. Let me just make sure. So again, this wasn't coming from the Vitis vinifera, it was coming from the Chinese Hawthorn berry. And so one of the archaeochemists coming out of this area, Dr. Patrick E. McGovern from the University of Pennsylvania, states this in his findings. The jars contained a consistently processed beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit, probably the Chinese hawthorn. And that's shown here in the image on the right-hand side. So as you're looking at this image, it doesn't look necessarily like a grape, but it does look very similar to a cherry, or as I show with the cutaway portion in the circular region in the top right corner, almost looks like it has the texture or consistency of an apple. Dr. McGovern goes on to say, it has a high sugar content, meaning it could harbor the yeast for fermentation. So the wine in this pottery essentially has been, I should say the fruit in this pottery had been fermented to a wine, or at the very least a wine-like substance. However, they're not exactly sure how it would have tasted. The Chinese hawthorn berry was typically described as being a little more tart, like an apple. And that's most likely why they added the honey as part of that sugar to just give it a little bit more sweetness or a little bit more flavor. But there has been some question, I don't want to use the word controversy, I do want to say question at, is this really wine? Well, based on that definition that I mentioned back at the beginning, that wine doesn't necessarily have to be specifically from a grape, that it could be from a fermented fruit. In that case, this does fall into that. And therefore, as I mentioned, China is currently on the leaderboard for having the oldest known evidence of wine and wine production. So as we move a little further into the ancient world, another beautiful map from our collection, this area, again, in between those 30 to 50-degree latitude lines, these countries here are kind of the foremost, most well-known areas that we think of in wine in today's terminology. But with that in mind, this is still not where wine really originated, cultivated, and was shaped. It's actually going to come from this region over here. And you're looking at part of Asia Minor, an area that was once known as Mesopotamia. Now, if you know anything about Mesopotamia, or if you don't, it's located in what is modern day Iran, part of Iraq, and all of that in Asia Minor, but specifically between the Tigris and Euphrates River. And at this, that still today, scholars refer to this area as the Fertile Crescent. Now, one may not think that this is the best place for wine cultivation. You think of it as more of a desert region, very dry, very arid. So how is this great cultivation really going to thrive when we think of it in more from coming from these more humid, warm, tropic Mediterranean regions? Well, the Caucasus region was actually not just well populated, but the kind of environment around the Caucasus Mountains actually gave it a perfect environment for wine cultivation further north. And then what would happen is that wine would be transported into more of the village / city areas of these Mesopotamian societies. So it would be transported down the river in its final product, where it would be enjoyed by the people who lived there. And I wanted to point that out because, again, we as a Maritime Museum really try and focus as many of our stories on how the water has really provided so many aspects, not just to our present life, but in the past as well. So these rivers are providing some of the earliest accessibility of wine to a general population of people living in the Mesopotamian region. So some more archaeological evidence coming out of what we refer to as Mesopotamia and focusing specifically on present day Armenia, showed in the map on the left-hand side from Google Images, from Google Earth. There's a cave called Areni 1. It's an excavation site in Armenia. And here is one of the earliest evidences, not just of wine production, but of actual wine manufacturing on a slightly larger scale. No one is really entirely sure how, this knowledge of wine came about. Who was the first person who discovered that the juice from these fermented grapes led to this beverage that could be enjoyed, that could, just be really well passed along and spread throughout these cultures? But once they figured it out, they really kind of started running with it and began slightly mass producing it on a larger scale. Now, this particular excavation site in the cave wasn't necessarily large in the way we think of a wine press or even a distillery or a brewery or anything like that today, but it's the first evidence that they are starting to really, as I said, mass produce, or at least semi-mass produce wine on a larger scale. So they said beginning between 2007 through about September 2010, archaeologists found the earliest known wine press for stomping grapes, fermentation in storage vessels, drinking cups, and withered grapevines, skins, and seeds, the earliest, most reliable evidence of wine production. And again, through biochemical techniques, they were able to determine this. They are still fairly regularly digging on the site and uncovering more evidence about it. But I really wanted to rely on kind of these firsthand accounts and archaeological evidences to kind of support and show the spread and transition and movement of this product as cultures as well begin to spread out. And here is a beautiful panoramic site image, credit from Wikipedia, showing this cave. And again, it's along the Arpa River. So also just tying in that maritime connection and showing how these waterways really are home, or at least great roads for this product and many products that are also going to be part of the trade goods and commerce routes throughout history. So just kind of expanding on this notion of humans moving further out. So we've kind of moved from Mesopotamia, and we're going to continue this westward expansion slowly across the Mediterranean Sea. So now we're kind of relying on these bodies of water, moving from rivers and expanding that further to a larger body of water that is the Mediterranean Sea, one of probably the most influential maritime areas in early trade. And what I have shown here are two evidences, additional kind of sites showing that wine production was taking place. On the left-hand side is a site from Palakistro on the island of Crete off of the coast of mainland Greece. And I have, if you can see circled in red there, the location on the site labeled E is where they also found a wine press. And what they described was the wine press had a treading floor with remains of flooring composed of flagstones and plaster, which sloped towards a hole in a low barrier wall. The hole gave onto a stone spout set above a tank coated in waterproof plaster. Adjacent was part of a store building, which was probably used as a cellar. So most likely kept in a cold, dark place, which is very conducive for the preservation of wine until you're ready to enjoy, especially like in a time of ancient Greece where they didn't have refrigeration in the way we are lucky enough to have today. So again, just a really great example on how this wine production is starting to not just spread, but grow. And Crete in particular was home to this group believed to have been there of the cult of Dionysus. And Dionysus, who the counterpart of him, the Roman counterpart, is Bacchus. These two deities were the gods of wine. So there were regularly large festivals held in his honor. And there would be everything from singing, dancing, feasting, and part of that feast, when you are celebrating the god of wine, has to include wine. So there's this kind of understanding or belief that, again, wine production is really starting to kick up, taking it up a notch, and being enjoyed on a much larger scale amongst the masses, not necessarily just for the rich and not just necessarily for daily life, but also for religious purposes as well. And then on the right-hand side is a beautiful relief from the tomb of Nakht in Luxor, Egypt. And these scenes kind of take you through the cultivation process. Towards the top, you can see some vines and some Egyptian figures picking the grapes of them. In the middle portion of the relief, you can see the fermentation process, or what we believe would be the fermentation process, and the storage in these jars. And then on the bottom of that panel, these jars are going to be loaded onto boats and carried up the Nile River into and throughout the Mediterranean. The Vitis vinifera grape is not native to this region, so it most likely would have been transported and traded with the Egyptians from the cultures coming out of Asia Minor. So the Mesopotamian people, as I mentioned, and then the Phoenicians, who we are also going to look at in just a moment. Now, the image on the left from Wikipedia is one of my favorites, and there's so many great images out there of this object called a quebre. And the reason I love it, and if you Google it, these things are massive. If you kind of look at the image here, you can gauge that it's pretty sizable compared to the gentleman who was standing next to it. And in other images where it's standing upright, you really get an idea of how large these vessels are. Worry not, these typically weren't used for transportation. They typically would have been buried in the ground up to about where the neck is. The grapes would have been placed inside, and then over time and through the process, smashing of the grapes, peeling of skins, and all of the fermentation would have taken place inside these jars. And being underground and most likely in a cooler climate, such as the cave that I showed in Armenia, would have just helped this process. It would have taken a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, depending on what type of wine you were trying to produce or how fast you were trying to get it. But I wanted to kind of demonstrate that these aren't going to be the vessels that are going to be transporting the wine, whereas the image on the left showing a beautiful amphora and one of my personal favorite items from our collection, these would have been the types of jars that would be transporting liquids throughout the Mediterranean, including olive oil, water, and of course, wine. So just amphora is much smaller, much easier to transport. It would have had a lid so that it could stay safe, and they would have been transported upright in some type of stand and everything on ships as they made their way throughout that region. But I highly encourage you to Google some images of the Quebre just to kind of see how large and how massive these things really are. And people in Georgia, Armenia, and that region that I've mentioned already, a lot of these wine vineyards and such still rely on these older methods, these traditional styles of producing wine. So you can still kind of see this happening if you get the opportunity to visit any of these areas and get to experience kind of being a part of this process and seeing it firsthand, which, having done research over the past several months, I have now added this onto my bucket list, which continually overflows, but that's a whole separate thing. So as I mentioned, the Phoenicians are perhaps one of the quintessential groups of people responsible for really establishing a thorough trade and commerce spread throughout the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians kind of began their culture over here in the southern portion of Asia Minor, present-day Syria, right above modern-day Israel. And over time, they're really gonna expand their industries. They're gonna spread out, especially after Alexander the Great comes in and takes over much of that region. And one of their main epicenters for trade is gonna be the port of Carthage, right over here, if you can see my arrow, on what is the North African coast, present-day Tunisia, but right along that same Mediterranean coastal line. And there's going to be major ports like this by the Phoenicians all throughout this area that traders are going to begin to rely on very extensively. And of course, one of the goods that's coming out of Asia Minor and spreading across this waterway is going to be wine. So over time, it's going to make its way into Egypt, the wine trade, that is, parts of North Africa over into Carthage, as we've seen into Greece and what later becomes Rome and the Iberian Peninsula, which is home to present-day Spain and Portugal. And then eventually the Roman Empire is really going to take off and take over much of this area, including as far up into present-day Great Britain, England, Germany, and modern-day France, and then some. And with that, again, this trade and commerce is really gonna start settling in a lot of these major cities that Rome is gonna be relying on to make money, also for them to tax. And as they're doing this, this spread of idea is also gonna be not just an exchange of goods, but also an implementation of various cultures and cultural ideologies and cultural processes as they really begin to settle in and establish new cities, new areas, new just ventures altogether. So as the Phoenicians kind of begin that process, the Roman Empire is really going to latch onto it. And as I mentioned with Greece, it's going to kind of make wine part of their religious aspects, religious festivals. Those who are in power are going to be enjoying it for recreational purposes. Poor people, lower class citizens are going to be not just using it as part of their religious lives, but it also at certain times in history was safer to drink than water. It also provided caloric intake for those who maybe couldn't always get sufficient food and the necessary sugar for things like blood level, which I know sounds really crazy, but if we think about what doctors say today about red wine, how it does have some heart healthy benefits, they were using this same kind of methodology and ideology even back then. So as this, region really expands, and you can kind of see by the purple shading I've included surrounding up into parts of the Black Sea, but really along the Mediterranean and right to the western portion of Europe and Africa, touching the Atlantic Ocean, these trade goods, including or especially wine, have now become commonplace throughout many of these regions. Many of these regions, as you can see, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, even Germany, which is a major player on the wine world stage today. This is kind of going to be how this product came to these areas. And in just a minute, I'm going to kind of explain how they grew even further from there and who was responsible for that. But I wanted to take a minute and throw out a fun fact here. So as trade expanded, as shipbuilding, as ships became larger and people began traveling farther, the methods in which they would transport a lot of these goods moved away from things like the amphora that I mentioned to something like a cask or a barrel. Now, if you've ever heard anybody say a buttload of something, if you've had a buttload of wine, that is actually a maritime term. A butt was actually a size used for these casks and barrels that came in different sizes from small to large. And so if you do happen to drink a buttload of wine, in all seriousness, you will be very sick, most likely won't even survive, because that is equivalent to about 126 gallons of wine. So while it may sound fun to say and does have a maritime background, I am in no way condoning anybody who is listening today or hereafter to attempt to drink a buttload of wine, but no pun intended with that. As we move, I did want to include that because it really is just a fun fact in all seriousness. So now we are going to move into more of the medieval era. The fall of Rome, the fall of the fall of the Western Roman Empire is going to come around 476 AD or CE, the Common Era. And as the Roman Empire falls and everything begins to be rebuilt, these old ideas are going to go away, and the new idea of the church, specifically the Catholic Church, is going to begin to take place in this same region. So, and the image on the left is from our collection. It's just another really beautiful image here. And you can see the image on the right, a monk enjoying some wine. We'll assume he's taste testing or sampling and not just sneaking some for his own benefit. But as the as the church kind of begins to take hold and spread into many of those areas that was once the Roman Empire, as shown on this map here, it's going to also become another major player for not just the wine trade, but at this point, wine cultivation, vinification, that is the vine, and the creation of vineyards throughout most of Europe and parts of North Africa up until the 7th century when the Islamic culture came in. And since alcohol is not a part of their religious background, wine production wasn't taking place here. So how is this happening? Why is this happening? Well, again, as the Roman Catholic Church is spreading and really kind of implementing their ideologies into the region, they're also going to establish not just churches in local cities, but monasteries in many of the outer rims as well. And the church at this time is rich, it's powerful, it is essentially in charge. Even for a lot of the monarchies, the church was word. It was almost more king than the king of a lot of these areas. So, and if you look closely at this map here, a lot of those dots are centers of Christian diffusion as it's listed. And you kind of take a look at where some of these areas are in Italy, France, Spain, even up into present day Great Britain. And what's going to happen is these monasteries and monks and bishops are actually going to be given money and grapes to start planting vineyards for the production of wine, both for their religious purposes, as it is a major part of their daily consumption with communion and sacraments and stuff. So, and then they are going to really start transplanting a lot of these grapes throughout the regions. And these vineyards are going to start being produced and then growing and thriving and really cultivating into what becomes its own wine industry. Now, the church eventually does, while Catholicism is still a very powerful and very modern religion still today, eventually the kind of eccentricities of it and with the monarchies and such did semi-die down a little, but it was still kind of commonplace for these areas to have these vineyards. And that is just a brief summary. I could go in much more detail as to the role that the church played in really cultivating these vines and vineyards in the region, but I really wanted to include this because these areas where the Roman Catholic Church is really going to be seated in power, again, many of the monarchies like France, eventually Spain, Portugal, and Italy, those four powerhouse countries, very familiar and associated with wine today, the church was heavily responsible for not just bringing this product there, but then mass producing it on a much wider scale than we have seen up to this time. And with that, we are going to take a semi-closer look at these four regions of Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. These are among the top regions of wine producers in the world. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into every aspect and look at every, region, sub-region of each place, but I did want to include what I thought were some beautiful maps here to kind of demonstrate where a lot of this wine production, this cultivation and vinification is taking place, and then produce at least one kind of informational about each of these places as well. Although no fun fact, in my opinion, is as much fun as knowing that a buttload does come from a maritime term, which is always fun when you are teaching to kids, which is what I do more so than to adults. So forgive me. But so looking at the map on the left, in 2020, Italy produced approximately 49.1 million hectoliters of wine, which is equivalent to roughly slightly over 6 billion bottles, making it the world leader in wine production at that time. Italy and France, I should note, regularly go back and forth. If you look at some of these statistics and figures over the past decade at the very least, you will see that Italy and France are always right on each other's heels as the leading producer of wine. So France's reputation as a world leader, as we have seen very similarly to Italy, is deep-seated in kind of those, centuries of being able to cultivate this product. So in 2020, France produced nearly 46 million hectoliters, or not quite 6 billion bottles. So it's right on Italy's heels as the second foremost leading producer of wine. But again, there have been periods where wine was number one in that top spot. So France's northern regions are typically more known for their whites, where the southern regions are better known for their reds. And one of them being a good example is the Bordeaux region right over here on kind of the western coast of France. Now, that's not the end all be all. That's not to say that whites aren't being produced in the northern regions or the southern regions, my apologies. It's just that that is typically what each place is known for. Moving over to the Iberian Peninsula here. On the left is the country of Portugal, another top leader in wine production. Portuguese wine is best known for the production of port wine, and that's fairly easy to remember. Port, if you did not know, is a fortified wine, which essentially means that it's carefully blended with a spirit such as brandy or a similar cognac, which is often considered the cousin of wine. The reason for that is because that actually stops the fermentation process before all the sugar converts to alcohol. So ports typically have a higher alcohol content, anywhere between about 19 to 21%, versus a lot of more standard wines, which is about 11 to 12, 13%. And ports are going to be much sweeter, so they're typically associated as being more of a dessert wine. And if you are familiar with wine consumption, you know, you think of red wines as being drunk out of larger goblets, similar with, you know, some white wines and stuff. But the port is often enjoyed in more of a smaller 3-ounce glass. Again, because it is much sweeter and has a much higher alcohol content, it should be sipped more slowly. And then moving over to Spain, shown on the right-hand side, while Italy might be the leading producer of wine, Spain is actually the world leader in terms of vineyard area. Spain currently holds nearly 1.2 million hectares, which is equivalent to over 4,600 square miles, and that is about 2.4% of the entirety of Spain. Spain is just shy of 200,000 square miles. So it may not sound like a large percentage, but when you think of it in those terms, that much of the country is specifically dedicated to vines, vineyards, and wine production, kind of makes it easy to see how it can be a world leader. And I do find it funny, though, that Spain has more vineyards, but Italy is a world leader. But we won't get into all of that at this time. And if you really think about where each of these 4 countries are situated, again, they're right within that ideal locale of 30 degrees to 50 degrees in the northern latitude. So it kind of makes sense how these 4 areas are really leaders on the world wine production stage. And this is not to say that these are the only European wine producing countries, but in terms of just focusing on the more both familiar and leading ones, these 4 are right in that bubble. So that was kind of a look at the old world and ancient world wines. Now we're going to move very quickly into the new world. And those are going to be the portions of the world that came after Christopher Columbus comes and crosses the Atlantic Ocean. So if you think of it in maritime terms, we've started with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We've expanded a little larger to the Mediterranean Sea, and now we are crossing oceans. So this product, among with, several many others, are now reaching a global scale, not in just terms of trade and commerce, but also in production. So we're going to be looking at the areas of North and South America and Australia and some parts of Africa, which were later opened up. Even though we talked about Africa as being part of the old world, many explorers weren't fully sure the size of that continent and that it did indeed kind of conjoin the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, which is why it kind of falls somewhere in between there. So when Christopher Columbus in 1492 sails westward across the Atlantic Ocean, he opens up this new world. At the same time, Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama are going to sail along the western coast of Africa, reach the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and then sail into the Indian Ocean, thus confirming not just Africa's size, but that it is not connected to the bottom of the world, but is connected and surrounded by these oceans. So many of the Portuguese explorers are going to kind of start populating and colonizing much of Africa, including South Africa, which we will look at in just a minute. But other explorers from many of these European countries we've already looked at. Christopher Columbus, Italian by birth, but representing Spain in his travels. Hernando Cortez, as he's also known as, another Spanish explorer, and James Cook, who comes a little later, British explorer, and is going to kind of be more in that Pacific, South Pacific region. Many of the French explorers, just as a note, are going to come slightly later to the game after the Spanish, the Italian, and even some of the British, and they're going to go a little further north. But these, the Spanish in particular, and then the British as well, are really going to kind of start this new world production of wine. And while the Vitis vinifera is not necessarily native to the New World, North and South America and such, North and South America do have their own native grape populations. And not only do we know this just from, historical accounts, but specifically Viking explorer Leif Erikson made it to the eastern seaboard of North America, and actually in his notes described the place as Vinland or Vineland, in reference to these multitude of grapevines that he encountered while he was here briefly in the North American region. So as they begin coming, particularly across the Atlantic Ocean, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British are going to kind of populate different pockets of what they refer to as the New World. On the left-hand side, where you see California, Mexico, Chile, and Argentina, are going to predominantly be where your Spanish explorers sailing for the King and Queen of Spain are going to wind up. And of course, throughout many of much more of the South American regions, but these are going to be some of the places where wine production is still very prevalent today. The Portuguese are going to go to Brazil and, as I mentioned, South Africa and begin cultivation there. And then a little later on, we're going to see the British coming to parts of North America. And I have highlighted here Virginia, since we at the Mariners Museum are in Virginia, as well as Australia down in the right-hand corner portion of this map. And as they come, they're going to find that while vinification is possible here, it's going to take a little bit of trial and error. The grape that they're more familiar with didn't always survive transport. It was a long, arduous voyage that, oftentimes either ended in shipwreck or just spoiled, materials on board because of the length of time it took to get to these areas. The wine itself often didn't survive the journey. It just didn't keep all the time. It's not going to be contained in the best of conditions for that day. But they are going to be able to bring some of their Vitis vinifera over to this area and kind of start making hybrid grapes, which would then produce vineyards throughout these regions and then kind of create New World wines, as they are called, even still today. And there's very little to no evidence indicating whether or not Native Americans, indigenous people of these areas enjoyed wine, or at least for the purpose of, just not entertainment value per se, but not even as part of their religious life, although they did have their own alcoholic beverages as part of their daily consumption or weekly or religious consumption and stuff. So with that, kind of showing where these old world empires then expanded into new world areas, just demonstrating once again that spread predominantly westward. We started in Asia Minor and then have really started bringing this product and the production of it on a much larger global scale. And in today's terms, there are still several of these places indicated here that are major players in the wine production stage. And we're going to take a look at a couple of those, beginning with South Africa. Now, grapes are not native to South Africa. It was actually a product brought by the Portuguese once they colonized the area, but it is smack dab in that 30 to 50 degree latitude in the southern portion of our planet. And so they found it really was a magnificent region for wine production. So Pinotage, which is actually one I had never heard of, I am happy to admit, prior to doing more research on this specific program. So Pinotage is South Africa's signature red wine grape. It's a gutsy cross between Pinot Noir and a Cinsault, rarely found anywhere else in the world. And it was developed around 1925, so it's still a fairly new, not even 100 years old, type of wine product. So, and I hadn't really heard of a Cinsault grape either. This predominantly came from France and then was brought into Portugal, and then the Portuguese really made it their own when they crossbred it with the Pinot Noir to create a Pinotage. So if there's anybody on here today who has had the pleasure of sampling this wine, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, your take on how it tastes, where you encountered it, so on and so forth, because I am definitely gonna give it a try or sample at my earliest convenience. Moving over to Australia. So Australia's wine history stretches back to when Governor Phillip, quote unquote, discovered Australia for the British back in 1788. And immediately upon his arrival or shortly thereafter, they began planting grapes and cultivating them and creating this vinification product and production in Australia. Now, Australia is a massive country. So if you look at this map here, really not too much of it is populated with wine production. You see some of it in the Perth area on the western portion of Australia, and then regions of it on the eastern seaboard as well. Although much of Australia does have a dry, arid climate, which most likely may not be conducive for vinification and wine culture. But Australia and the production of wine for this country, they produce one of my personal favorite wines to enjoy, and that is the Syrah. It says in 1833, James Busby, considered the father of the Australian wine industry, brought cuttings from Spain and France and introduced Syrah, a bold, full-bodied red wine, and it remains Australia's most popular variety and is their most exported wine. And I thank them for that because it is definitely one to be enjoyed. And moving to the third image here in South America. Now, this map only highlights a portion of South America. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay are all, again, part of that major player list that I kind of keep mentioning in wine production. This particular map predominantly highlights parts of Chile and Argentina. And Argentina produces perhaps my absolute most favorite wine to enjoy. I know I said I enjoy the Syrah. That's in my definite top 3. And if you're familiar with South American wines, specifically Argentinian wines, they are familiar and well known for their Malbec, a very robust, full-bodied wine. I genuinely just enjoy the flavor, the smell, and everything that encompasses this. And it's funny because when people think South America in terms of trade commodities, even still today, and import, export, especially export, coffee is what typically comes to mind. But Argentina in particular is a leading producer of wine and in kind of that top bracket of wine import, export, and production. So these are just some of the areas where New World wines are still very popular and are still being very heavily produced. And of course, as we kind of wrap up and start to bring it home, we are going to talk a little bit about wine production in the United States. Again, we here at the Mariners Museum and Park are located in Hampton Roads, Virginia. Virginia does barely, but it cracks the top 10 in the leading wine producing states. We are number 10 at that, but hey, we're still in there. And it may come as no surprise to anybody who is familiar with the wine industry. And if you are not, California is commonly on the top of the leaderboard for wine production in the United States. And just another fun fact, the US is the leader of wine consumption on a global scale. And I'm sure that probably increased even a little bit more during last year's pandemic when most of us were trapped at home and had nothing to do but enjoy each other's company and crack open a bottle of wine and just cheers to the old days that were gone and seeing what lies ahead post-pandemic. So here's a brief look at the California wine region. If you are or are not familiar with the California wine region, it is predominantly along the northern aspect of the state. That was not always the case, though. It was actually Southern California for the longest time when those Spanish conquistadors and explorers really started populating the region. Southern California was really where the wine production was taking place. When did all of that change? That came in the mid-19th century with the California Gold Rush. Up in the Sutter's Mill area, not too far outside of where present-day Napa Valley, Sonoma, San Francisco is over in there as well. With this influx of people moving to this region, all these people are coming, so then towns are being established. Mines are starting to be kind of worked. People are, working the rivers in search for gold. And well, they could have water if they want, but why have water when you can have wine? And that's exactly kind of the thought that took hold in this area. Even though the gold rush eventually went bust, the wine production for this region did not. It was actually the exact opposite. It took off and began soaring. There are periods in history where California and other countries, for example, World War I, World War II, the wine industry was hit hard, especially during World War II, prior to the US's entrance and involvement. There's actually stories you can hear of vines from France and grapes that were sent over to parts of California to continue being cultivated here for fear of that industry being lost as Hitler and the Nazi regime was in power in France. So that probably also helped make this region an even more thriving, conducive area for vinification and wine production. So here you are looking at a recent chart of the International Organization of Vine and Wine. And essentially, part of their mission is that they are the intergovernmental body responsible for tracking wine and grape production worldwide. And as of January 1, 2021, it is made up of 48 member states, so roughly 48 countries, some territories and such. And so they're the ones who are giving us a lot of this information on who is on the leaderboard of wine production, import, export, all of those fun stats that we kind of just looked at. And as you can see here, Italy in 2020, again, was at the top of that, followed very closely by France, and then Spain and the United States and Argentina kind of rounding out that top 5 spot. Excuse me. As you make your way around the rest of this chart, many of the countries that I either mentioned today or showed outright are within that kind of top 15 to 20 tier and bracket. And then there are some countries on here, which again, like Russia, Romania, even Hungary, some of those Eastern European countries, it's not necessarily that I'm surprised that they're, wine producing countries, but they are, again, they're producing enough wine that they're rivaling some of the other countries that you might even think would be ahead of it and everything on a much smaller scale, yes, but they are still up there. And then the rest of the world encompasses the last kind of couple percentage of vinification and wine production, import and export globally. And with that, I believe that is not only just time, but I could really go into so many different facets of the wine industry, the wine history, the spread of the trade, that unfortunately I just wasn't able to cover today. But I put up two to three great resources here. The website winefolly.com is a great kind of beginner wine. They've even got a chart on there for like beginner wine 101 and all of that. If you are just kind of finding your kind of foot in the wine world and the enjoyment of it, along with the International Wine and Vine website, oiv.int, international group. And on the right is this book that I had purchased for part of my research, but also it was slightly recreational. It's a great book, 9,000 Years of Wine. Again, I didn't have enough time to cover 9,000 years of wine super in depth, but that's a great resource if you were looking to learn a little bit more about some of these aspects that I did include. And then just very briefly before I hand it back over, the websites for the Mariners Museum and our catalog, if you want to see some of the collection items, not that I just showed here, but also related to other maritime aspects and facets that we are the repository for. And very last and not least, my personal email, if you think of any questions or wanted to know more about something specific that maybe I touched on or didn't touch on and you were hoping that I would go further into, I am always happy to take time to disseminate as much information to the best of my ability in whatever capacity I can to our wonderful audience and guests who come not just through our doors, but through our computer screens like you are virtually. And with that, thank you all for your time this evening. I'm going to hand it back over. I'm not sure. I did my best to leave some time for Q&A. If not, I do apologize. I'm happy to hang around if that is the case, but I will hand it back over to Louisa. And thank you all again.
All right, thank you, Erika. That was great. I'm not turning on my camera right now, but I'm gonna ask the questions. So we have a few questions in the Q&A box. First is, what is your take on Washington State wines? I find them light and enjoyable.
On which wines?
Washington State.
Washington State. So to be honest, I haven't had as many Washington State wines. I've had several Oregon wines, and I do find them very enjoyable. I've had several whites. I can't think of anything specific off the top of my head, as they were traditionally or typically gifted to me. I knew several people who were from Oregon, and when they came back from family vacations, they would bring back something. So I can't necessarily speak to Washington State, but because they're in a very similar region and very similar climate, I would definitely say it's worth trying if it's anything like the Oregon wines I've had the pleasure of experiencing.
And I'm sure in the group in attendance today, we have a few Wine Classic committee members, and they may have an idea.
Absolutely, yeah, feel free, jump in.
Then we have a question from Jerry Hanley. Do you have figures on US consumption relative to the rest of the world?
I do, and I will, let me see, I had stuff like that in my presentation at one point, and then as I kind of cut down and cut back, I started whittling stuff like that out because I didn't want to bog anybody down. And I don't see the actual chart here in any of my leftover secondary notes. But as I did mention, the United States is the leader for wine consumption. The actual number on that, I can't, unfortunately, and I do apologize, give at that time, but we do imbibe the most wine than any other place globally. So yay us. And I will be happy if there's any contact information that I can take down, or if Louisa has it, I can absolutely find where my notes were on that and then give it to you specifically and personally.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. We see Jerry at the museum often, so you know the answer. And then you have another one. Can you read the question there, Erika, too?
Let me see.
From Mark and Mary Pinkerton.
Answered. I do not. I see two from Gerald and then the one on the Washington wine. Oh,
yeah.
How do you think the Rhine-Main wines compare with the California wines? The Rhine-Main. So are these, and I apologize because I really kind of stuck very specifically to the Italian French. So I'm thinking this sounds like it might be a German or Germanic type. But I am not familiar with that one. I will say I am definitely more in the somewhere between a novice and intermediate when it comes to wine. I'm still exploring very much, so I cannot attest to that one, and I do apologize.
I'm writing it down anyway, and we'll
please do
as a committee and ask them questions and see what they think.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I apologize, I don't know that one. My computer froze. Am I frozen?
No, you're not. I wish I had the knowledge to answer the questions. We got another question. Which country leads in per capita consumption?
Well, as I mentioned, the United States is up there. We are on the leaderboard of that. I apologize. Can I still be heard? My screen froze, unfortunately, and I'm trying to get it back.
We can see you perfectly.
Okay, great. So that's still going to be the United States at that, as I mentioned. I apologize. I'm doing like two things, trying to make sure I'm heard and seen and everything. You would think after a year I would have this technology stuff down, but I do not. Yes. But yes, again, that kind of falls into that United States consumption. We are the leading. We have been for several years. I don't know if that's a good thing, a bad thing, or just a fun fact to know. But yes.
Fun fact. So we have another question from Easter Thompson. She's asking if the U.S. made, excuse my accent, Malbec wines are they wine? Are there U.S. made Malbec wines? She's asking if there are U.S. made.
Gotcha. Most likely, yes. So a lot of the wines that I mentioned, even though they are home to or staples of those regions, aren't necessarily indicative that they can't be produced anywhere else. However, one thing I didn't state, and some people may be familiar with this, is that certain wines like Bordeaux or sparkling things like Champagne cannot hold that name unless they come specifically from that region. However, most New World wines like the Malbec are, the name is not indicative of the region which it comes from, but more so the hybrid grape or the grape from which it comes from. So there most likely is at least a vineyard out there. I couldn't tell you one specifically or off the top of my head, which vineyard in the United States, but there is most likely a strong probability that there is a Malbec being produced somewhere in this area in the North American region, because they are allowed to use that Malbec title.
Very good.
But that is one one that is typically more so imported, just like the Syrah is kind of the leading export / then import to the US from Australia.
So we got a person, Mary,
Oh, it's France.
her husband, in Google. Yeah.
Yes,
France is the first one.
per
France,
capita, yes.
Makes sense. So I think that's it with questions right now. I have very positive comments and feedback in the chat
Thank
box
you.
as well. So before we leave, we want to thank everyone for attending. Like Molly said at the beginning, we can't wait until next year. We're coming up with a really fun plan for 2022. And as soon as we have more details, we'll be sharing with you. And we also want to thank the Brunswick Society for all of your support to our mission and our collection and all of our conservation efforts. So if you're interested in learning more about the Brunswick Society, we'll just put the web address to find more information, brunswicksociety.org. So everyone, thank you, Erika. Thank you, Molly and Howard. And thank you all of you for attending. You have a good night.